Thank you for asking the question, Ms. Bonilla. So I will just tell you my perspective on those original baseline costs and schedule, because you're going to see this across the board, especially on projects that have been in the works for a long time. The way that original cost is set, that's set in the feasibility study report. That's a process of planning the project where departments are asked to estimate how much is it going to cost, how long is it going to take. That process, again, back then took forever. It took, I think they probably started planning for this in 2009. The FSR was finally approved in 2010. They're asked to set those baselines at a point before they ever go out to the marketplace. At that point, they've not gone out to the bidders and said, how much will it actually take? And I will tell you something else, which, kind of telling a little bit of inside baseball here for the administrative folks that work in the executive branch. I used to be a departmental CIO. And so the game you play is, okay, we got to get it funded and we got to get it approved, right? We're not actually out to the marketplace yet, but we're asked to come up with these numbers. So folks tend to be optimistic about that. My contention has been, and that's why we've changed the process now, is that those baselines aren't really set based on real data of what it'll actually take. So, almost every single project that you're going to see, you're going to go back and say, oh, it's over budget and it's, and it's late. Well, why? Because those baselines were set at a time 2 years before you went to the market and really without a realistic baseline. I do know this. I know that the initial bid that Accenture submitted was about $83 million. It was negotiated down. Now, some of that, I think it was because we were in a really bad budget time at the time and nobody was getting funding for anything. So I think and then that negotiated down price ended up being closer to $43 million total. That was subsequently reflected at an SPR. But I don't think those baselines are actually reliable baselines. The processes that we're putting in place, and I know we'll have a chance to talk about this on Thursday, really move that process, that establishing of the baseline schedule and cost, till after you go through the marketplace. I think that'll give certainly the administration and the legislature a more realistic assessment of what a project actually will take to do. Now, having said all of that, there are still changes that drive costs, changes in law, changes in practice. Some court case makes a new ruling that says you have to change something in the system, delays, because most of these costs are really the cost of staff, whether it's state staff, the cost of contractor staff that are working on a system, right? So the longer a project goes, the costs do go up. But in direct answer, I don't think that was a realistic figure, especially given the fact that they had missed some of the requirements, some of the needed functionality. So yeah, I mean, it looks really bad, but if you're going to catch up and actually come in with the right functionality, that number would have been higher to begin with.
Well, and I guess it goes to the point that it doesn't make a lot of sense for anyone, and no one ends up at the end of the day with the proper information they need if we're using bad numbers.
Absolutely agree.
And it makes the state look very irresponsible, to its constituents as well.
Sure.
Well, I hope too that part of your calculation going forward is also about the cost of this transition within the departments. And we haven't talked a lot about that, but in terms of the workforce, in terms of the fact that you just touched on it, that you had boards and commissions who needed a lot of training, who maybe did not understand what this real shift was. And that is a cost that I think needs to be estimated up front in terms of, and not just the cost, but the realistic capability of departments. It's wonderful to say, oh, technology is just going to solve all of our problems. And then there's the human, component, the human reality, and that maybe it isn't going to solve all the problems. That it's going to take a lot longer to train our workforce. It's going to take longer to implement this. And I hope that's all being calculated in as we're looking at technology as an efficiency improvement and all the words we use. And then we hit this brick wall of, it's just too hard for people to, without training, to figure out how to use it. So we still have that opportunity going forward. It hasn't been fully implemented. I hope that at this point there will be some real serious looks at the actual cost.
I appreciate that comment, because that is exactly what we're doing for Release 2. Change management is absolutely crucial. and, you know, that's where my department fell down with not incorporating change management in conjunction with the rollover of a major IT project. The second is the proximity of training, which is robust. We have a lot of curriculum, but the proximity of the training to the actual rollout. And that's where we missed the mark on that one. It's like preparing for a game. If you train for the game too far away from the actual game, all of that training is for naught. So what we're doing is, as if the schedule of the release moves, so does the training. We did not do that with the first release. So those two components will help the human aspect and the culture aspect of this release 2, as well as giving us enough forethought for what we do with the remaining clients in release 3. Thank you for that.
Madam Chair, if I could also add, I think that is a very important point. And so I know we'll talk about this more on Thursday at Thursday's hearing, but that is one of the fundamental lessons learned that we've seen across the project portfolio and that we're baking into our new process. And it is not only focused on the impact of organizational change, but also precisely to your point of assessing an organization's capacity to take on the change and, you know, by extension, take on a project. So, you know, we'll talk more about that on Thursday.
Very good, thank you. Assemblymember Baker.
Thank you. And this dovetails with Assemblywoman Bonilla's point as well. It's not just that costs, if we're not starting with the right baseline and meeting realistic numbers that are rigorous but still realistic, it's also the other milestones that you have. For example, that a test of the system can be done in 8 weeks, so that when it happens in 11 months, which we've talked and seen in the report many reasons why that was a problem, including, you know, trying to change the program as you go along in the 11 months, but it's not just cost, which is absolutely correct, it's setting appropriate milestones. And if they can't be set, that shows that we're lacking the expertise internally to set up a system that will work. So I encourage that same discipline and introspection that you'll be taking with respect to cost to be realistic milestones. They still need to be rigorous. So this can't be, well, let's set something way far out so that we know we can meet it. But making sure that you are providing that discipline as well. And I'll also add to this point, and I apologize if it came up earlier, I heard pieces of testimony with, again, respect to the contracting process I wanted to follow up on. Understanding that Accenture has contracted out with other state agencies and departments for technology purposes. And then I heard separate testimony, but we don't know what their performance was. We don't know how well they performed and if they had problems there. Are there methods in our contracting system for looking at prior existing relationships, and has a contractor potentially totally dropped the ball, and so that the left hand in the government's not talking to the right hand, we just repeat that problem?
Sure. Let me try and address each of those points. I think the testimony you heard is, I gave the testimony of all the different projects. I think Director Kadani said he didn't know how they're doing. I certainly know. And I think the rest of the state and those departments certainly know how they've done. They've performed in those and have delivered, and I actually mentioned that. They've delivered working systems that have allowed departments to actually meet their needs from a programmatic perspective. Secondly, on the issue of you know, I think I just lost the point, but you were talking about testing and making sure that those
The milestones are realistic, not just with respect to cost.
I wanted to point something out there. So that is certainly one of the things that you have to look at, and I'm just going to name a couple of other ones that we, again, have done a lot of work at identifying these as potential risk and also success factors on projects. Testing is certainly one of them. The way you make decisions on projects, we call that governance, so effective decision making. What you do with data from the old systems and how you convert it and how you treat it. There's a whole host of different components that all have to work together. So to your point, yes, we're looking at all of that as part of the process, as part of our oversight of a project. And we'll get into this on Thursday as well. But in addition to looking at that, we've also developed resources for departments, because in a sense, it's not fair to expect departments to have expertise in all of those areas. So my office has developed a set of consultants, a set of specialized staff on testing, on governance, on documenting of requirements, on data governance, on you know, probably 7 or 8 different topics that we see as coming up over and over. So, you know, on Thursday, we're going to get into some disagreement with the auditor as to whether we should have the role of providing that expertise and that assistance and that consulting to departments. You know, we can go out to the private sector and contract for that, or we can get good at doing that within government. We think we have the right role in government to do that, and we've developed the skill set so that we're now able to bring that to bear. And then your final point on, you know, how do we hold vendors accountable? You may not have been in the room at the time, but I did mention that now that we have procurement over on our side, we're also in the process of developing essentially a vendor performance report card, where we are going to be tracking how vendors do on California projects, and we're not sure if it's going to be on projects outside of California. There's some issues with that. And then documenting that, keeping that, making it public, and then taking that into account next time that vendor goes and bids on a California project. So we're in the draft stages of that. We can talk about it on Thursday, but I'd say within a couple of months, we'll be able to bring it out and start piloting it, and then also running it by the vendor community, because they're going to have to live with it.
Thank you. We'll have a lot to talk about on Thursday.
Director Godani.
If I could just buttress up what my colleague said, specifically to my department, those milestones are absolutely vital to the health and safety of, you know, this project, or I would submit any project. Specifically to Breeze, what we learned, as I stated, the original problem was the contract and the anemic requirements in that contract that led into not enough time in testing, a design that was based on those initial requirements. Therefore, we needed 11 months in a testing phase. All of those issues have been remedied in the amendment that we're speaking of. We have a rigorous design process that my boards and bureau in Release 2 have enjoyed. Very detailed methodology that went into their design. We have more time and quality controls even before the boards go to the testing phase. The department will run tests independently of the boards to make sure that what we ask for is essentially there. We also have more time in testing for end-to-end testing. So what I'm saying, essentially, the milestones that you accurately point out, we have baked into this new contract as lessons learned.
I did want to just clarify one thing. You indicated that the testing period that my understanding is, as the auditor mentioned earlier, that a lot of the problems were based on the fact that the department did not have adequate preparation in place, did not have the expectations, did not have the design framework of what they should do and what the program should implement. So that was the result of the 11 months over the 11 months over what should have been 8-week process.
Yes, I want to qualify the answer in that, yes, there was no baseline design. The auditor is absolutely correct. There was not what we have now, which is here is what the state is asking for. Therefore, please develop scripts and test against this and see if it passes. We did not have that. The fluctuations in design that was evident to everybody was because during that during the testing phase, the product did not meet the business needs of the boards and bureaus. So the irony is we did not have a baseline design, therefore we could make fluctuations in that product without the state being charged. We did not have a contractual baseline, therefore you saw wild fluctuations in the design to better meet the business needs. The problem in that is you're defeating the very purpose of what a testing phase is. A testing phase is you're supposed to have a set parameters of a design and you test against that and you simply say, does it work or doesn't it work? If it does not work, you have provisions in the contract to hold the vendor accountable. So that's the only difference that I see in what happened.
Very good, thank you. I have one final question. You mentioned, ongoing costs from the original contract, and I think there was a time frame at the end of March, which would be now. What is the actual cost per month going forward, and what's the anticipated time for, I guess, the next phase, or for that to conclude as we move into phase 3?
The per month price from Accenture is around 1.2 million. What happens after March is predicated on conversations that Director Ramos has with the vendor in the event we need more time.
More time to implement phase 2?
No. More time. I'm sorry. I thought the question was in the context of the Section 11, the delayed Section 11,
Yes.
et cetera. Absolutely. So if there's more time needed past the end of March, then the price of that is predicated on what the conversations that Caltech Director Ramos has with the vendor, similar to what has happened thus far, going from the February 27th to where we are now. It will be similar to that. If the
Do we know
director
how
would like
long
to-
that would continue for?
I'm going to have to ask you guys to weigh in on this, but I think what's trying to say is we negotiated a deal with Accenture, right? That's reflected in the SPR 3.1. It's meant to correct a bunch of the issues that we've identified to give us a better contract and break off release 3 and say we're going to take care of those after we go through the corrective actions that we have in place. Delaying, the delay that you're talking about, the impact of that, we have an agreement from Accenture that till the end of this month, they'll hold everything steady there. Beyond that, you know, if there's a delay in approving that, you know, that stretches on longer, it shifts the project schedule out. It also makes some impact, and you guys are going to have to weigh in on this, some impact into the work that they can be doing under the current contract, the existing contract for the Release 1 boards. Under the current contract, they should have started for Release 2 already. We told them, hold on, we need some changes to this, and Release 2 and Release 3. Well, sorry.
I'm sorry, Release 3 under the current contract.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right.
Just
We
to
told them, hold
clarify.
off on Release 3. There should be some design work for Release 2 and actually an implementation schedule that we don't think is realistic under the current contract for Release 2. That's the part. So I'm sorry, I misstated.
So we don't know what the cost is going to be going forward at this point.
Well, at this point, it'll depend on when the project, when the contract is
Right.
actually concluded, when it's actually approved and we can execute it. There's some financing that we're doing for the project, right, where we change the financing mechanism. If the delay goes on too long, we got to start that process, go through that process again, which again, delays us from being able to sign the contract. So I don't have a firm fixed answer because I don't know what the start date or end date would be at this point.
I guess the concern that we have, and as you've been exhibited today by the comments, there isn't a lot of confidence in the project, certainly from the beginning, and certainly a lot of displeasure over the amendment that occurred that no one was aware of. So I would hope that as this moves and the transition through the Section 11, through the next agreement, that you keep the committee informed of all of these changes on a monthly basis, just in some type of memo or some type of notification, so that we can follow it and make sure that we're not getting behind the 8 ball again, which would present a problem. And I think that would be critical for our understanding of the success of the project in the long term. Yes.
And just a follow-up suggestion as we move forward, I think it would be very helpful is if the committee tracks with the auditor's timeline in terms of the reporting back at 60 days, the ultimate 1-year report back, and that we certainly don't have to wait for, sunset or another process. We could actually, I think, build in better accountability from the legislature by actually having your reports and the responses sent to the committee so that we are actively tracking the responsiveness. And this would go, I think, for all your audits. It would be, helpful for the appropriate committees to know. And then just another follow-up on the idea of the report card. It would be, I think that's a great idea. I always think it's great to get your report card, but what happens when you take it home is really the question, right? So we need a little accountability on that. But I think involving the auditor as you develop this report card system would be very helpful, given what the time and the expertise that they have put in to understanding the problems. Let's make sure that there is that look at, from the auditor's perspective, of this idea of keeping track of how performance is actually taking place.
So, yeah, I don't disagree. In fact, what happens when you take it home will come to bear when it comes time to bid on another project, right? That's our intent, is to actually use it as part of the evaluation. So that's where it'll come to bear. I'm happy to let the auditor review it. Like I said, we have a draft. When we did, I know this isn't directly the auditor, but when we went out with the idea, we called the vendor community together and said, hey, we want to measure your performance. We want your help in coming up with a system that's fair. I know the IT contractor that they used was at the meeting, so I know that they've been aware of it at least. And actually, we asked for volunteers from the vendor community to help us come up with a good model, and one that we could actually test against them, where we could say, okay, well, we think this makes sense to us. What's the problem if we do it? What will it keep you from bidding, or where are the holes? So we're doing that, and we do have a work group. I don't think your guys on the work group, but we do have a volunteer work group that's helped us put it together. So we have a draft. We're really close. I'm happy to let them look at it once I've looked at it, and once I'm happy with it. But we do. And if I could say one other thing to Mr. Hill's comment. One of the things that we're going to be doing, and you know, I'll commit this to you guys, but also to the rest of the committees, whether it's budget staff, budget committees, or any of the other committees, we want to start doing a more regular briefing of the legislature across the project portfolio. You can send your staff or whatever. We can give you just periodic updates on where things are going. Because I think one of the things that's frustrating to the legislature is we have a large portfolio of projects. A lot of them are in flight. A lot of them have very many of the same principles going on and some of the same fundamental issues and challenges. So, you know, you see them once in a while when they surface, but we want to keep you up to date and informed. The other thing that I think is really important is to let you know the ones that are working well, because unfortunately you only ever hear about the ones that are not working well. You know, we didn't get it done in time for this, but we put together a list of something like 170 different projects that have all been implemented or you know, successfully concluded just in the last few years, but you never get to see those. So we like to bake that into our overviews and our portfolio reviews with the legislature. So we're going to get out to the committee staff and to the budget subs an invitation to attend and hopefully do them over here on a regular basis.